A black mother and her young son boarded a plane, ready for a long overdue family reunion. But what began as an ordinary flight turned into something unimaginable. A flight attendant, already on edge, unfairly targeted the boy, humiliating him in front of stunned passengers. Just 7 minutes later, everything spiraled out of control. And what happened next left everyone speechless, igniting a series of events no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. If this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that shine a light on the truth. The terminal at Gate 22 was alive with movement, an orchestrated chaos that mirrored the complex web of lives intertwining within its walls. Business travelers marched with the urgency of men carrying kingdoms on their shoulders. Parents juggled strollers and boarding passes like circus performers, and the intercom hummed with reminders no one truly listened to. Amid the din, a young boy's laughter rang out, a sound so light and free it seemed almost out of place. "Mom, look at that plane." Liam pointed eagerly toward the tarmac, his bright eyes wide with wonder. At his side, Sophia, his mother, stood serene, an anchor amidst the tide of bodies rushing past. She smiled softly, adjusting the strap of her sleek leather bag, her movements as poised as a conductor leading an unseen symphony. "Stay close, Liam," she said, her voice a firm but gentle melody. The boy's energy was irrepressible. He skipped slightly ahead, his small backpack bouncing with every step. It was then that it happened, a moment so small it might have passed unnoticed had it not been for what followed. Liam brushed against a flight attendant, Ava, who was striding toward the gate. Her uniform was crisp, her hair tightly coiled in a bun that seemed to mirror her rigid posture. The accidental collision stopped her in her tracks. "Watch where you're going," Ava snapped, her voice slicing through the air like a whip. Liam froze, startled by the sharpness of her tone. His cheeks flushed as he mumbled, "I'm sorry," retreating instinctively toward his mother. Sophia stepped forward, her movements measured, her gaze calm but piercing as it met Ava's. "I apologize," she said softly, her tone devoid of confrontation but rich with authority. She placed a reassuring hand on her son's shoulder, her fingers a quiet reminder of safety. Ava's eyes flickered to Sophia, then back to Liam. She muttered something inaudible under her breath and stalked away, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. Around them, the crowd seemed to inhale collectively, the tension fleeting but tangible. Passengers exchanged quick glances before averting their eyes, their discomfort palpable but unspoken. Sophia crouched to meet Liam at eye level. "You're okay," she said, brushing his cheek with her hand. He nodded, but the brightness in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a shadow of doubt, a small crack in the armor of his innocence. When the boarding announcement came, the crowd surged toward the gate in a wave of controlled chaos. Ava stood at the front, her professional smile back in place. But when Sophia and Liam approached, her gaze lingered on them for a moment too long. The tension from earlier seemed to hang in the air between them, invisible but heavy. The flight itself began uneventfully. Liam's excitement returned as he pressed his face to the window, marveling at the wings slicing through the clouds. Sophia, ever watchful, helped him fasten his seatbelt, her movements as precise and composed as ever. Ava moved through the aisle with mechanical efficiency, stowing luggage and answering questions, her demeanor brisk but professional. Yet, as the hours ticked by, the cracks in Ava's facade began to show. A request for water from Liam, a simple, polite, "May I please?" was met with a sigh and a hastily poured cup that sloshed onto the tray table. The boy recoiled, startled by the spill, his small hands fumbling for a napkin. Ava's response was sharp and dismissive. "Be careful," she barked, as though the fault was his. Sophia's voice cut through the rising murmur of disapproval from nearby passengers. "Thank you," she said evenly, handing Liam another napkin from her bag. "We'll take care of it." She didn't look at Ava as she spoke, but the weight of her words was unmistakable. For the first time, Ava hesitated, her movements faltered, and her professional mask seemed to slip, revealing a flicker of something beneath: irritation, perhaps, or discomfort. The undercurrent of tension in the cabin grew with every passing moment. Liam, now quieter, occupied himself with a book from his backpack. Sophia, her expression calm but unreadable, seemed to take in everything. The glances exchanged between passengers. The way Ava avoided their row. The whispered conversations that spread like ripples in water. At the rear of the plane, Ava recounted the water spill to a colleague. Some people think they're entitled to everything, she muttered, her voice low but charged. That boy, she stopped abruptly, catching herself as a passenger passed nearby. Her colleague raised an eyebrow but said nothing, busying himself with arranging meal trays. You're just tired, he offered diplomatically, his tone neutral. But Ava wasn't tired, she was unraveling. The memory of Sophia's steady gaze, of her quiet, unwavering presence, gnawed at her. It was a look she couldn't shake, one that seemed to see through her, past the surface, into something raw and unspoken. Midway through the flight, Liam wandered into the aisle, his curiosity drawing him toward the galley. When Ava spotted him, her irritation flared. What are you doing back here? She snapped, her voice louder than necessary. Go back to your seat. The boy flinched, his earlier confidence evaporating. He mumbled an apology and turned away, his small frame seeming even smaller as he shuffled back to his mother. Passengers who had witnessed the exchange murmured among themselves, their frowns deepening. Sophia's eyes followed Liam as he returned to his seat, her hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture of quiet reassurance. But when she looked toward the galley, her expression changed. Her calm composure was still intact, but there was a sharpness in her gaze now, a resolve that hadn't been there before. The rest of the flight passed in a haze of mounting tension. Ava moved through her duties with a growing sense of unease. The whispers of passengers, the occasional lingering glance they weighed on her, pressing down like an invisible hand. By the time the plane began its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin was charged. The unspoken conflict between Ava and Sophia casting a shadow over everything. As the plane touched down and passengers began to gather their belongings, Ava avoided looking in Sophia's direction, but she could feel the woman's presence, steady and unyielding, like a storm gathering on the horizon. When Sophia finally stood to leave, she turned to Ava. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. You should think about what just happened, Sophia said softly, her words as measured and deliberate as her movements. Then she was gone, leaving Ava standing frozen in the aisle, her heart pounding and her mind racing with the weight of what she could no longer ignore. The hum of the airplane engines settled into a lulling rhythm as the flight ascended to cruising altitude. The passengers began to find their places in the routine of the journey, reading, dozing, or quietly conversing. But for Sophia, there was no such reprieve. Her son, Liam, sat beside her, his small face pressed against the window as he watched the clouds stretch endlessly into the horizon. She smiled at him, but the edges of her calm were fraying. From the corner of her eye, she saw Ava move briskly through the aisle, her demeanor clipped and her smile strained. Sophia knew that kind of smile. It was one meant to keep others at bay, to guard against questions, to shut down the possibility of connection. It was a smile built on walls, and Sophia had no patience for walls today. Liam, oblivious to the weight of his mother's thoughts, tugged at her sleeve. Mom, can I have a snack? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. She nodded, handing him a small packet from her bag, her mind still on Ava's face and the sharpness in her tone earlier. Thank you, he whispered as he opened the snack, his eyes bright again for the first time since the encounter at the gate. But as she watched him, Sophia felt a knot tighten in her chest. It wasn't just the moment with Ava, it was the accumulation of moments like it. The unspoken weight of being seen but not seen, of being tolerated but not welcomed. It was the tension of knowing that the world didn't always feel like it belonged to them, even when they'd paid for their seat on the plane just like everyone else. The turbulence started subtly, a slight jolt that made a few passengers glance up from their magazines. Ava's voice crackled over the intercom, crisp and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some minor turbulence. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Sophia glanced at Liam, whose eyes had widened. It's okay, baby, she said, her voice soothing. She placed a hand on his arm, steadying him as the plane jolted again, this time with more force. Ava appeared in the aisle, moving down with mechanical precision to check on passengers. When she reached Sophia and Liam's row, she paused, her gaze briefly meeting Sophia's. The moment stretched longer than it should have, the tension between them palpable. Ava's eyes flickered to Liam, then back to Sophia, before she nodded curtly and continued on. Sophia exhaled slowly, her hand still on Liam's arm. "You're doing great," she whispered to him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. But her own calm was beginning to erode. Not from the turbulence of the air but from the turbulence brewing beneath the surface unspoken. Unresolved, the turbulence subsided, and the cabin settled back into an uneasy calm. Sophia glanced around, noting the subtle ways people avoided meeting her gaze. It was a familiar dance one she'd witnessed in boardrooms, grocery stores, and now this plane. People rarely wanted to confront discomfort, even when it was right in front of them. Ava returned to the galley, her movements sharp and deliberate. She spoke to her colleague in hushed tones, her frustration evident. "I don't know what's wrong with some people," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard by passengers nearest the back. "They act like the world owes them something." Her colleague frowned but didn't respond. Instead, he busied himself with the drink cart, leaving Ava to stew in her own agitation. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The memory of Sophia's gaze lingered in her mind, a quiet, unyielding strength that made Ava feel exposed, as if the woman had seen something in her she wasn't ready to face. Liam pressed the call button on his seat, his small hand tentative as if he were unsure whether it was allowed. Ava appeared moments later, her expression carefully neutral but her body language stiff. "Yes," she said, her voice clipped. "Could I have another water, please?" Liam asked, his tone polite, almost apologetic. Ava sighed audibly, reaching for a plastic cup. She filled it hastily, the water sloshing over the sides as she handed it to him without a word. Liam hesitated, his small hands trembling as he took the cup, trying not to spill it. "Careful," Ava snapped, her tone sharper than the moment required. Sophia's head snapped up, her calm composure cracking ever so slightly. She met Ava's gaze, her eyes dark and steady. "That's enough," she said quietly, her voice firm but low. The words hung in the air like a warning, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Ava's lips pressed into a thin line as she straightened. Avoiding Sophia's eyes, she turned on her heel and walked briskly away, leaving a trail of discomfort in her wake. Sophia reached for Liam, brushing his cheek with her hand. "You're okay, baby," she said, her voice softer now. "You didn't do anything wrong." Liam nodded, but his earlier brightness was gone, replaced by a quietness that felt too heavy for a child his age. Sophia's heart ached as she watched him, the knot in her chest tightening with each passing moment. The murmurs began to ripple through the cabin, faint at first but growing louder as passengers exchanged glances and whispers. "Did you see that?" one woman murmured to her seatmate. "That was uncalled for." Others nodded in agreement, their eyes darting toward Sophia and Liam, then back to Ava. The tension in the air was no longer beneath the surface, it was rising, swelling like a wave that threatened to crash at any moment. Sophia sat back in her seat, her gaze fixed on the window, but her fingers drummed lightly against the armrest, a subtle sign of the storm brewing within her. She had spent years perfecting the art of calm, of grace under fire. But even the strongest walls had their limits. Across the aisle, a man with a tablet began typing furiously, his fingers moving like a pianist hitting all the wrong notes. Another passenger discreetly raised her smartphone, angling it toward the aisle as if capturing the unfolding drama would give it meaning. Ava moved through the cabin, her movements stiffer now, her professional mask cracking under the weight of the eyes watching her. She could feel their judgment, their unspoken questions, and it unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. Sophia's gaze followed Ava, her eyes sharp but unreadable. She wasn't angry, not yet, but there was a quiet resolve in her expression that spoke volumes. She wasn't going to let this pass. Not this time. The plane cruised on, but the turbulence wasn't over. It had only just begun. The hum of the engines provided a backdrop of deceptive calm as the plane cruised at 30,000 feet. The cabin seemed settled, with passengers lost in their books, screens, or conversations, but beneath this veneer of tranquility, a storm brewed, silent, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Sophia sat upright in her seat, her fingers laced tightly around the armrest. She watched Ava weave through the aisle with forced precision, her movements mechanical, as if she were trying to keep herself from unraveling. Liam leaned against Sophia, his small body nestled into her side. He had grown quieter as the flight went on, his initial excitement replaced by a subdued stillness. Sophia stroked his hair absent-mindedly, her eyes narrowing as they tracked Ava's every step. The encounter over the spilled water replayed in her mind. The sharp tone, the clipped words, it wasn't just rudeness. It was something deeper, something heavier. She'd lived long enough to recognize it, the cold, calculated dismissal of someone deemed less important. In the galley at the rear of the plane, Ava leaned against the counter, her fingers gripping the edges as though steadying herself against an unseen force. Her colleague, Thomas, glanced at her with curiosity, sensing her unease but saying nothing at first. "You all right?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. "I'm fine," Ava replied, her tone brisk but brittle. She didn't meet his eyes, focusing instead on rearranging cups and napkins that didn't need rearranging. Thomas studied her for a moment before continuing. "You've been off today. Is it the turbulence? Or something else?" Ava's hands stilled, her fingers curling into fists before she forced them to relax. "It's just been a long flight," she said flatly, but the lie was as transparent as the water in the pitcher beside her. Thomas didn't press further, but his silence carried an unspoken question. Ava could feel it hanging in the air between them, as heavy as the judgment she felt radiating from the cabin. She exhaled sharply, muttering under her breath, "People always looking for a reason to complain." Thomas raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning back to his own tasks. Ava's gaze flickered toward the aisle, where passengers sat in their neat rows, oblivious to her inner turmoil, or so she thought. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, her every move scrutinized. Sophia wasn't the only one who noticed Ava's discomfort. Across the aisle, an older man with graying hair leaned toward his wife, whispering, "She's been curt with everyone, but it's different with them." His wife nodded, her brow furrowed in quiet disapproval. Nearby, a young woman with a phone discreetly captured footage of Ava's interactions, her camera angled just enough to avoid detection. Whispers rippled through the cabin like a low current, passengers exchanging quiet remarks that hinted at a collective unease. Sophia felt their stares, but she didn't acknowledge them. Instead, she focused on Liam, who was now flipping through a book with small, deliberate movements. His face was calm, but Sophia could see the tension in the way his fingers gripped the pages. "Liam," she said softly, drawing his attention, "are you all right?" He nodded but didn't speak, his eyes darting briefly toward the aisle where Ava had disappeared. Sophia's heart clenched. She knew the look, the quiet, unspoken question in his gaze. Why had Ava been so harsh? Why did it feel like he had done something wrong, even when he hadn't? Sophia reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "It's not you," she said firmly. "You did nothing wrong." A sudden jolt shook the plane, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've hit another patch of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened." The cabin grew still, the atmosphere thickening with unease. Ava emerged from the galley, her expression tight as she moved down the aisle to ensure passengers were secured. When she reached Sophia and Liam's row, she hesitated, her eyes briefly meeting Sophia's before darting away. "Seatbelt check," Ava said tersely, her tone devoid of warmth. Sophia held her gaze, unflinching. "We're fine, thank you." The words were polite, but their delivery was deliberate, carrying an undercurrent of challenge. Ava stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line before she moved on. The tension in the cabin was palpable now, an invisible thread connecting everyone to the conflict that simmered just beneath the surface. Passengers exchanged glances, some leaning across aisles to whisper their thoughts. "Did you see that?" one woman murmured to her seatmate. She barely looked at them. Others nodded in agreement, their expressions a mix of discomfort and quiet indignation. The murmurs grew louder, a low hum of dissent that Ava couldn't ignore. Her steps faltered as she returned to the galley, her professional facade beginning to crack under the weight of the cabin's collective judgment. Sophia turned her attention back to Liam, her hand brushing his hair as she spoke softly. "You're strong, baby," she said. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Her words were meant for him, but they resonated with those around her. Passengers who had been silent until now began to sit up straighter, their whispers growing bolder. The sense of shared discontent rippled through the cabin, uniting strangers in a way that only shared outrage could. In the galley, Ava felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. She leaned against the counter, her breaths shallow as she tried to steady herself. But the whispers, the stares, they were everywhere, suffocating her. She couldn't escape them, no matter how hard she tried. She thought of Sophia's gaze, the quiet strength in her eyes, and it unnerved her in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't anger or confrontation, it was something deeper. Something that made Ava feel exposed, vulnerable. She hated it. The turbulence outside had settled, but the turbulence within the cabin continued to rise. Sophia sat back in her seat, her expression calm but her resolve sharpening with every passing moment. She wasn't one to seek confrontation, but she wasn't one to back down from it either. The plane was quiet now, the hum of the engines the only sound as passengers settled into an uneasy silence. But the silence wasn't peace, it was the calm before the storm. The moment when everything could shift in an instant. And Sophia knew, deep in her bones, that this wasn't over. Not yet. The atmosphere inside the plane was heavy, like a storm cloud ready to burst. Though the turbulence outside had subsided, the air within the cabin remained taut with unspoken tension. Sophia could feel it pressing down on her shoulders, a weight that wasn't entirely her own. It was in the quiet stares of passengers, the stiff movements of Ava as she maneuvered through the aisle, and the barely contained whispers that buzzed just below the surface of audible conversation. Liam shifted in his seat, his small hand resting against the armrest. He was quiet, but Sophia could sense his unease. It wasn't the kind of unease born from fear of flying, it was the kind of quiet that only a child who'd felt the sharp edge of dismissal could carry. She leaned toward him, her voice low and steady. "Do you want to color?" she asked, pulling a small packet of crayons from her bag. Liam nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. He reached for the crayons, his fingers brushing hers, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. But Sophia's eyes flicked toward the aisle, where Ava stood a few rows ahead, her back stiff and her expression unreadable. The flight attendant was trying to maintain her composure, but Sophia could see the cracks forming. In the galley, Ava braced herself against the counter, her breaths shallow as she tried to shake off the weight of the passengers' judgment. She could feel their eyes on her, their silent accusations cutting through her carefully constructed armor. Her colleague, Thomas, glanced at her from the other side of the small space. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone cautious but concerned. "I'm fine," Ava replied sharply, but the words sounded hollow even to her. She glanced toward the cabin, her gaze lingering on Sophia and Liam's row. Something about the way Sophia had looked at her earlier, calm, resolute, yet piercing, had unsettled her. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was worse. It was understanding, a knowing gaze that seemed to see through her entirely. Thomas followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "If something happened, you can tell me." "Nothing happened," Ava snapped, her voice louder than she intended. She saw Thomas flinch and immediately softened her tone. This job, you know? People expect so much." Thomas didn't reply. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to the task at hand, leaving Ava alone with her thoughts. Back in the cabin, Sophia noticed the shift in passengers' energy. The whispers were growing louder, and the glances exchanged between rows were becoming more pointed. A woman a few seats ahead turned to her neighbor, her voice carrying just enough to reach Sophia's ears. "She's been rude to that boy all flight," the woman said, her tone dripping with disapproval. "Poor kid didn't do anything wrong." Sophia kept her gaze forward, her expression calm, but the knot in her chest tightened. She didn't need validation from strangers, but their murmurs confirmed what she already knew. This was no longer just about Liam or even Ava. This was about something bigger, something that had been brewing long before they stepped onto this plane. Liam tugged at her sleeve, his eyes wide and curious. "Mom, why are they looking at us?" he asked softly. Sophia hesitated, her heart aching at the question. How could she explain it to him? How could she tell her son that the world often viewed people like them with suspicion? With a wariness that clung to every interaction? She leaned closer to him, her voice gentle. "Sometimes people don't understand us, baby," she said, "but that's not our fault. That's theirs." Liam nodded slowly, but the weight of her words seemed too heavy for his young shoulders. He turned back to his coloring book, his small hands gripping the crayons tightly. The silence didn't last, as Ava returned to the cabin to serve drinks. The tension between her and the passengers reached a breaking point. She moved down the aisle with her cart, her movements stiff and mechanical. When she reached Sophia's row, her hands trembled slightly as she placed a cup of juice on Liam's tray. "Thank you," Sophia said, her tone polite but firm. Ava nodded curtly, avoiding Sophia's gaze, but as she turned to move on, a man seated across the aisle spoke up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice louder than necessary. "You spilled water on the kid earlier, didn't you?" Ava froze, her shoulders tensing. She turned slowly to face the man, her professional smile faltering. "That was an accident," she said, her tone defensive. "Sure didn't sound like an accident," the man replied, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't have to snap at him like that." The passengers around him murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder. Ava's face flushed, her mask of professionalism slipping further. "I don't have time for this," she muttered under her breath. But the words carried enough weight to ripple through the cabin. Sophia watched the exchange in silence, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. She could feel the air around her thickening, the unspoken tension finally bubbling to the surface. She turned to Liam, her voice soft but steady. "Stay here, sweetheart," she said, rising from her seat. Ava turned as Sophia approached, her expression a mixture of irritation and unease. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The silence between them was deafening, a chasm filled with the weight of history, of unspoken grievances and unacknowledged truths. "You seem tense," Sophia said finally, her voice calm but edged with steel. Ava opened her mouth to reply but hesitated. The eyes of the passengers were on them now, watching, waiting. "I'm just doing my job," Ava said defensively. Sophia tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "Your job is to make people feel safe, isn't it? To treat everyone with respect?" Ava's lips pressed into a thin line. "I treat everyone the same. Do you?" Sophia's question hung in the air, sharp and cutting, because it doesn't feel that way. The murmurs around them grew louder, passengers leaning forward to catch every word. Ava's cheeks flushed, her composure unraveling under the weight of Sophia's gaze. "I didn't mean," Ava started, but Sophia cut her off. "You didn't mean to snap at my son? Or you didn't mean for everyone to notice?" Sophia's voice remained calm, but her words carried the force of years of unspoken truths. The cabin fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the engines. Ava looked away, her shoulders slumping as the weight of Sophia's words sank in. For a moment, she seemed smaller, diminished by the realization that she couldn't escape the judgment of those around her. Sophia stepped back, her expression softening as she glanced at Liam. "Come on, baby," she said, her voice gentle. "Let's finish your coloring." As she sat back down, the passengers around her nodded in quiet agreement, their murmurs now filled with admiration. Sophia didn't need to say more. Her presence, her resolve, had spoken volumes. But the tension in the cabin wasn't gone. It lingered, heavy and unyielding, a reminder that the storm brewing within this small space was far from over. The air in the cabin had grown electric, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and collective unease. Though the hum of the engines remained steady, it no longer masked the charged tension rippling through the rows of seats. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, their whispers dying into a tense silence. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something to break, for the simmering conflict to boil over. Sophia sat in her seat, her hand resting lightly on Liam's shoulder. He was coloring, his small hand moving carefully across the page. But his movements were slower now, less certain. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Though he didn't have the words to name it, her own calm exterior belied the storm brewing within. She had spent her life navigating spaces like this, where every glance, every word carried a double weight. But now, she could feel the balance tipping. Across the aisle, Ava stood stiffly near the galley, her eyes darting between the rows of passengers. She could feel their gazes on her, sharp and unrelenting. The judgment, the murmurs, it was all becoming too much. Her chest tightened, and her breath quickened as she tried to regain control, to suppress the rising tide of emotions threatening to spill over. Her colleague Thomas approached her cautiously. "Ava," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You need to take a moment. Step into the galley. Breathe." Ava shook her head, her jaw tightening. "I'm fine," she snapped, but the words came out brittle, more defensive than reassuring. She knew she wasn't fine. The tension between her and Sophia, The murmurs of the passengers, it was all unraveling her carefully constructed facade. But what could she do now? She couldn't back down, not in front of all these people. Thomas hesitated, then sighed. Okay, he said softly, stepping back, but his eyes lingered on her, filled with quiet concern. The tipping point came a few minutes later. Liam, still coloring quietly, accidentally dropped one of his crayons. It rolled into the aisle, coming to rest just a few inches from Ava's feet as she moved past. She froze, her gaze flicking to the small object. Then to Liam. Excuse me, Sophia said, her tone calm but firm. Could you pass that back to him? Ava hesitated, her expression hardening. She bent down and picked up the crayon. But instead of handing it directly to Liam, she placed it on the armrest of Sophia's seat with a curt "Here." The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of dismissal. Around them, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Passengers exchanged glances, their whispers starting again, louder this time, tinged with indignation. Sophia reached for the crayon, her movements deliberate. She turned her gaze to Ava, her voice quiet but cutting. Do you have a problem with my son? Ava stiffened, the color draining from her face. I know, she stammered. I don't have a problem with anyone. Sophia's eyes narrowed. Then why does it feel like you do? Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, resonating through the cabin like a stone dropped into still water. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, their attention riveted on the confrontation unfolding before them. Ava opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, she managed, I'm just doing my job. Sophia tilted her head, her expression unyielding. Is your job to make people feel small? To treat a child like he's done something wrong when he hasn't? Ava's hands clenched at her sides. I didn't mean, she began, but her voice faltered. She looked around, as if searching for support, but found only the watchful eyes of passengers who had grown weary of her defensiveness. Maybe you didn't mean to, Sophia said, her tone softening slightly but losing none of its edge. But that doesn't erase the impact. My son deserves better. We all do. The tension in the cabin reached a crescendo. Some passengers began murmuring words of agreement, their voices rising in solidarity. Others sat frozen, caught between discomfort and quiet admiration for Sophia's courage. Ava stood motionless, her composure cracking under the weight of their collective gaze. In the front row, an older woman raised her hand, her voice clear and resolute. She's right, that boy didn't deserve to be treated like that. Another voice joined in from a few rows back. We've all seen it. You've been short with them the entire flight. The murmurs grew louder, swelling into a wave of voices that filled the cabin. Ava's face flushed, her eyes darting wildly as she struggled to maintain control. I didn't mean to, she tried again. But her voice was drowned out by the rising tide of discontent. Sophia, sensing that the moment had reached its peak, raised a hand to quiet the passengers. Enough, she said, her voice steady but firm. The cabin fell silent, the weight of her presence commanding attention. She turned back to Ava, her expression softening. I don't know what's going on with you, she said, her tone now more compassionate. But whatever it is, it doesn't give you the right to treat people this way. Especially not a child. Ava's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. For the first time, she looked directly at Sophia, not with defiance, but with something closer to shame. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. As the plane began its descent, the cabin settled into a tense quiet. The confrontation had left an indelible mark on everyone, and though the whispers had died down, the energy in the air was unmistakable. Passengers avoided Ava's gaze as she moved down the aisle, her movements slow and hesitant. Sophia turned to Liam, who had been watching everything with wide, curious eyes. You did nothing wrong, she said softly, brushing a hand over his hair. Remember that? Liam nodded, his small face lighting up with a tentative smile. Okay, Mom. Sophia smiled back, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew this wasn't just about her or Liam, or even Ava. It was about the countless moments like this. The quiet indignities that added up over time, shaping how people saw themselves and each other. It was about the fault lines in the world, the ones that were invisible until they weren't, until they cracked wide open for everyone to see. And though the flight was nearing its end, Sophia knew the real journey had just begun. The plane began its descent, tilting gently as the captain announced their approach. The usual shuffle of passengers preparing for landing, stowing trays, securing seatbelts seemed subdued, as though the entire cabin had collectively agreed to tread lightly. The air was thick with an unspoken understanding. What had just unfolded between Ava and Sophia wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sophia sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed out the window as the city lights twinkled below. To anyone watching, she might have appeared serene, but beneath her calm exterior, her thoughts churned like a storm at sea. She could feel Liam leaning against her, his small body warm and trusting, and that simple weight gave her the strength to hold steady. Behind her, Ava lingered in the galley, her back pressed against the counter as she took slow, measured breaths. The confrontation had left her shaken, her mind replaying every word, every glance. The other flight attendants avoided her now, their sympathetic silence offering no comfort. She felt exposed, like a performer who had forgotten her lines under the harsh glare of the spotlight. For Ava, it wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what it had unearthed. The look in Sophia's eyes had been more than accusatory, it had been knowing. And that knowledge was what unsettled her most. Ava couldn't explain why, but she felt as though Sophia had reached into her chest and pulled out something she'd tried to bury long ago, the gnawing, uncomfortable truth about herself. As the wheels touched the runway and the plane shuddered to a halt, the tension that had filled the cabin didn't dissipate. It lingered, heavy and oppressive, as passengers gathered their belongings. Most avoided Ava's gaze as she moved stiffly down the aisle, offering perfunctory goodbyes. But when she reached Sophia and Liam's row, she hesitated. "Have a good evening," Ava said, her voice flat but tinged with an attempt at professionalism. Sophia looked up, her expression unreadable. "You too," she said simply, her tone neither warm nor cold. Then she turned her attention back to Liam, helping him gather his backpack. The exchange was brief, but it felt monumental, as though a verdict had been handed down. Ava moved on, her steps heavy as she continued toward the front of the plane. Sophia and Liam disembarked along with the other passengers, their exit quiet but no less impactful. The murmurs of the other passengers followed them, like echoes in a canyon. Inside the terminal, the bright fluorescent lights and bustling crowds provided a stark contrast to the tension of the plane. Liam's excitement seemed to return as he pointed out the baggage carousel, his voice light with wonder. But Sophia's mind was still back on the flight, replaying the moments that had led to the confrontation. She wasn't angry, not in the way people expected when faced with injustice. Her anger had long since evolved into something more potent, a fierce, unyielding determination. It wasn't enough to survive these moments anymore. They needed to mean something. They needed to spark change. As they waited for their luggage, a woman approached her, a fellow passenger from the flight. She was middle-aged, her face kind but worn, with a softness in her eyes that hinted at both empathy and uncertainty. "Excuse me," the woman began, her voice tentative. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened back there, and I think you handled it beautifully." Sophia nodded, offering a polite smile. "Thank you." The woman hesitated, as though weighing her next words. "It's just, I don't understand why it has to be like this. Why people can't just be decent." Sophia's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet resolve. "It's not about decency," she said. "It's about the way the world is built. Some of us are always expected to be smaller, quieter, less than, and when we're not, it makes people uncomfortable." The woman nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I guess I've never thought about it like that." Sophia gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, then turned her attention back to Liam. The conversation was over for now. In the crew lounge, Ava sat alone at a small table, her head in her hands. The other flight attendants had left her to her thoughts, sensing that whatever she was grappling with was beyond their ability to fix. She stared at her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen as she debated whether to call someone. Anyone, to unpack the weight pressing on her chest. But who would she call? Who would understand? She couldn't even fully articulate it to herself the way Sophia's words had cut through her, exposing something raw and unexamined. Ava had always prided herself on being professional, on treating everyone equally. But now she wondered, had she been blind to her own biases? Had she dismissed Sophia and Liam because they didn't fit neatly into her preconceived notions of who deserved her patience? Her thoughts were interrupted by a message notification. It was from Thomas, Her colleague. You okay? Let me know if you need to talk. Ava stared at the message for a long moment before typing back a simple reply, thanks. I might. But even as she sent the message, she knew that talking to Thomas wouldn't resolve what she was feeling. The answer lay somewhere deeper, in the shadows of herself that she'd avoided for years. And she wasn't sure she was ready to confront them. Back in her car, Sophia sat behind the wheel, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as Liam chatted in the back seat. His voice was bright again, full of the innocent wonder that only children seemed capable of maintaining. But Sophia's mind was elsewhere. The confrontation with Ava had been a small victory. But it wasn't enough. It never was. She thought of the countless other moments like this on subways, in grocery stores, in workplaces where the weight of being unseen, underestimated, or dismissed had worn her down. It wasn't just about Ava. It was about a system, a structure, a history that perpetuated these moments over and over again. But then she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Liam, his small face illuminated by the passing streetlights. And she knew why she kept fighting. It wasn't just for herself, it was for him. For his future. For a world where he wouldn't have to carry the same burdens she did. Taking a deep breath, Sophia started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. The road ahead was long. But she was ready. Because the real work wasn't in confronting Ava or any single individual. It was in confronting the world itself and changing it, one moment at a time. Sophia's apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of paper as Liam colored at the dining table. It was his way of unwinding. She knew a small, comforting ritual after the tension of the flight. She watched him from across the room, her own heart still heavy. The encounter with Ava had left its mark, not just on her, but on the silent space between her and her son. The world outside their window was dark, the city alive with its own rhythms. But within these walls, Sophia carried the weight of the day, a weight she had learned to bear over decades of similar moments. This wasn't the first time she'd faced a quiet indignity disguised as professionalism. It wouldn't be the last. But tonight, it felt heavier somehow, as though the collective weight of all those past moments had come to rest squarely on her shoulders. Mom, Liam's voice broke through her thoughts. Soft and tentative, he held up his drawing, a picture of an airplane soaring through a sky of mismatched clouds. Do you like it? Sophia smiled, the warmth in her expression genuine even as her heart ached. I love it, baby, she said, crossing the room to kneel beside him. You're so talented. Liam beamed, his earlier unease fading in the glow of her approval. But as she hugged him, Sophia felt the sting of the day's events return. She couldn't shake the image of his small, confused face when Ava had dismissed him. It wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what it meant. About what it taught him, even if he couldn't yet articulate it. Across the city, Ava sat in her small apartment. The quiet almost suffocating. She had changed out of her uniform hours ago. But the weight of the day clung to her like a second skin. She stared at her phone, its screen glowing with unanswered messages. One was from her sister. A casual, "How's your day?" that Ava didn't know how to respond to. Another was from Thomas, her colleague, checking in again. Ava had read his message at least a dozen times. You need to talk about it. Keeping it in won't help. She wanted to ignore him, to pretend the day had been nothing more than an overreaction on everyone's part. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The confrontation with Sophia had been like a mirror held up to her soul, forcing her to see parts of herself she'd worked hard to ignore. And what she saw made her uncomfortable. Her mind replayed Sophia's words, calm, deliberate, yet cutting. My son deserves better. We all do. Ava had bristled at the time. But now, in the quiet of her apartment, the words echoed with undeniable truth. Had she dismissed Liam because of a bad day? Or was it something deeper? Something insidious that she didn't want to admit? Ava's fingers hovered over her phone screen before she finally typed out a reply to Thomas. Can we meet tomorrow? The next morning, Sophia woke early. She stood at the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea as sunlight streamed through the window. Today felt like an opportunity, a chance to turn yesterday's pain into something constructive. She had learned long ago that anger without action was like a fire without fuel. It burned out quickly, leaving nothing behind. She opened her laptop and began typing. Emails to the airline's customer service. Messages to friends and colleagues who had connections in advocacy. She detailed the events of the flight, not with anger but with clarity, weaving Liam's experience into a broader narrative about the subtle, everyday ways in which discrimination manifested. Her words were sharp but measured, carrying the weight of someone who had lived this reality far too many times. As she typed, she felt a sense of purpose settle over her, a reminder that her voice mattered not just for Liam, but for the countless others who couldn't yet find their own. Meanwhile, Ava sat across from Thomas in a small cafe. The air between them was heavy with unspoken tension. Thomas sipped his coffee, waiting patiently for her to speak. Finally, Ava set down her cup and met his gaze. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice low. "Yesterday, it wasn't just a bad day. It was something else." Thomas nodded, encouraging her to continue. I think I've been carrying things I didn't want to face," she admitted, her words halting but sincere. "I dismissed that woman and her son because I was frustrated. Sure, but it was more than that. There's something in me that needs to change." Thomas leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "The first step is recognizing it," he said. "But what are you going to do about it?" Ava didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time, she felt ready to search for one. Later that afternoon, Sophia received a reply to one of her emails. It was from the airline's customer service team, acknowledging her complaint and promising to investigate. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She read the message aloud to Liam, who listened intently. "Does that mean they'll make it better?" he asked, his eyes wide with hope. Sophia knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It means we're trying," she said, "and sometimes trying is the most important thing." Liam nodded, seeming to accept her answer. But as he returned to his coloring book, Sophia felt a renewed determination. This wasn't just about one flight or one interaction. It was about creating a world where her son and every child like him could grow up without carrying the weight of other people's prejudices. And for that, she would keep fighting. The day stretched long and unyielding. Sophia had spent most of it answering emails, her words deliberate and precise as she recounted the events of the flight. Each message she sent felt like a small stone tossed into a vast, rippling pond, a reminder that her actions mattered, even if the results were not immediate. By mid-afternoon, she found herself pacing the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Liam was in his room, humming softly as he played with his toys, blissfully unaware of the quiet storm swirling in his mother's chest. She glanced at the clock and sighed. The weight of the day had begun to settle in her bones. But she refused to let it crush her. The faint buzz of her phone pulled her from her thoughts. A new email had arrived from the airline's customer relations team. She opened it, her heart pounding. The message was polite but vague, promising further investigation and reiterating their commitment to ensuring all passengers feel respected and valued. Sophia read the words twice, her jaw tightening. It wasn't enough. She had expected as much. Institutions rarely moved swiftly when accountability was on the line, but the lack of urgency in their response stung nonetheless. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, centering herself. This was only the beginning. She knew that much. Across the city, Ava sat in her car outside her workplace, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She had spent the day reflecting, turning over every word Sophia had said to her during the flight. Each one felt like a small fissure, cracking the surface of a foundation she had thought unshakable. She had always believed herself to be fair, professional, even empathetic, but now, she couldn't escape the truth. She had failed. She had let her frustrations, her biases, her humanity erode the dignity of a mother and her child. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. Ava's phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text from Thomas. "Did you talk to anyone yet?" Her fingers hovered over the screen. She had considered reaching out to Sophia, but the thought filled her with dread. What could she possibly say? How could she begin to bridge the chasm she had created? Instead, she typed back a short reply, "Not yet. Thinking about it." Thomas's response came quickly, "You should. It might not fix everything, but it's a start." Ava stared at the message for a long moment before setting her phone aside. He was right, of course. But the thought of facing Sophia again felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure if the leap would lead to solid ground or an endless fall. That evening, as the city settled into its nighttime rhythms, Sophia received an unexpected phone call. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway, her voice steady. "Hello? Hi, is this Sophia?" The voice on the other end was hesitant but familiar. It took Sophia a moment to place it. "This is Ava," the voice continued. "From the flight." Sophia's grip on the phone tightened. For a moment, she said nothing, her mind racing. Finally, she spoke, her tone calm but cautious. "What can I do for you?" There was a pause, and Sophia could hear Ava inhale deeply before speaking again. I wanted to apologize. For everything. For the way I treated you and your son. It wasn't right, and I've been thinking about it ever since." Sophia closed her eyes, her emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to hang up, to shield herself from the rawness of the moment. But another part of her, the part that had always believed in the possibility of change, compelled her to stay. "Go on," she said. Ava hesitated, but when she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "I've been reflecting on why I reacted the way I did. I think I let my frustrations get the better of me. But it's more than that. I know there's a part of me that has been blind to things I should have seen, things I should have addressed in myself a long time ago." Sophia listened, her expression softening as Ava's words tumbled out. She could hear the vulnerability in her voice, the quiet desperation of someone trying to make amends. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Ava continued. "I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see how I contributed to something much bigger than a bad interaction on a plane. And I want to do better." For a long moment, there was silence. Sophia looked out the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Ava," she said, "acknowledging what happened is a good first step. But words alone aren't enough. What matters is what you do next." "I understand," Ava said softly, "and I promise, I'll do the work." Sophia nodded, though Ava couldn't see it. "Good, because people like my son deserve better. We all do." After the call ended, Sophia sat quietly for a long time, her mind replaying the conversation. She wasn't sure if Ava's apology would lead to real change, but she knew it had taken courage to make the call. And for that, she was grateful. In the other room, Liam called out to her, his voice bright and full of life. Sophia smiled, rising from her seat to join him. As she walked toward him, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a while, she felt hopeful. And hope, she knew, was the most powerful tool she had. The days following Ava's call settled into a kind of uneasy calm. But the memory of their exchange lingered in Sophia's mind like a faint but persistent echo. She carried it with her as she went about her routines. As she dropped Liam off at school. As she typed out another email to the airline demanding more than platitudes. The world outside her window moved with its usual rhythm. But within her, there was a growing urgency, a storm gathering strength. For Sophia, the apology was a start. But it wasn't an ending. It was a spark that illuminated the deeper, darker truths that lay beneath the surface of her daily life. The quiet indignities, the polite dismissals, the unspoken assumptions, each one chipped away at her resolve. But now she felt a fire kindling in its place. One morning, as she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the blinking cursor on her laptop, her phone buzzed. It was an email from a local advocacy group she had contacted after the incident. They wanted her to speak at an upcoming community forum about the experience. Sophia stared at the message, her heart pounding. She had always been cautious about stepping into the spotlight. Her fight had always been personal, rooted in the need to protect her son and preserve her own dignity. But this was different. This was a chance to turn her personal pain into something larger, something that could ripple outward and create real change. She took a deep breath and typed her reply. "I'd be honored to speak." Across town, Ava sat in a small conference room at the airline's headquarters. She had requested the meeting herself, a decision that had felt monumental in its own right. The room was sterile and impersonal, the kind of space designed to make people feel small. But Ava was determined not to shrink. Two members of the airline's management team sat across from her, their expressions carefully neutral. Ava had spent hours preparing for this moment, rehearsing what she would say. But now that she was here, her throat felt dry, and her palms were clammy. Still, she pushed forward. "I wanted to speak with you about an incident on a recent flight," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "It was brought to my attention rightfully so that my behavior toward a passenger and her son was unacceptable. And I believe it reflects a larger issue within our training and culture." The managers exchanged glances, their interest piqued. Ava continued, her words gaining momentum as she spoke. She described the subtle biases that often went unaddressed in their line of work. The ways in which flight attendants were conditioned to prioritize certain passengers over others. Often unconsciously, she recounted the moment Sophia had confronted her and how it had forced her to reckon with her own actions and the system that enabled them. I don't want this to be brushed aside as just one bad interaction, Ava said, her voice growing stronger. It's part of a pattern. And I think we have a responsibility to address it. Not just as individuals but as an organization. The room was silent for a moment after she finished. One of the managers nodded slowly. His expression thoughtful. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. He said, we'll discuss this further and follow up with you. It wasn't the definitive action Ava had hoped for. But it was something. As she left the room, she felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. She had taken the first step. But the road ahead was still uncertain. That evening, Sophia stood on the stage of a small community center, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. The room was filled with folding chairs, most of them occupied by a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Liam sat in the front row, his wide eyes watching her with a mixture of curiosity and pride. Sophia took a deep breath and began to speak. She started with the story of the flight, recounting the way Ava had dismissed Liam and the quiet tension that had permeated the cabin. But she didn't stop there. She wove her experience into a broader narrative about the ways discrimination manifested in everyday life, not always as overt acts, but as subtle, corrosive undercurrents that wore people down over time. I'm here tonight, she said, her voice steady and clear. Not because of one flight or one flight attendant. I'm here because this is part of something much bigger. It's about the world we've built and the assumptions we carry, often without realizing it, and it's about the choice we all have to do something about it. The room was silent as she spoke, the weight of her words settling over the audience like a heavy but necessary truth. When she finished, the room erupted into applause, the sound a mix of gratitude and determination. Sophia stepped off the stage, her heart pounding, but she felt lighter somehow, as though she had finally released something she had been holding onto for far too long. In her apartment that night, Ava watched a recording of Sophia's speech, sent to her by a colleague who had attended the forum. She sat on her couch, her legs tucked beneath her, her eyes glued to the screen. As she listened to Sophia's words, she felt a deep ache in her chest, a mixture of guilt and admiration. For the first time, Ava understood that the work she needed to do wasn't just about apologizing or improving her behavior. It was about confronting the systems and assumptions that had shaped her. About dismantling the biases she hadn't even known she carried. It was about more than her, it was about the world she wanted to help create. Ava closed her laptop and sat in silence, the quiet of the room amplifying the weight of her thoughts. She knew there was no quick fix, no easy redemption. But she also knew that she couldn't go back to the person she had been. And for the first time in a long while, that thought didn't scare her, it gave her hope. For both Sophia and Ava, the events of the past week had set them on new paths, different but intertwined. Sophia's fight was far from over, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that her voice mattered. And Ava, though still grappling with her own shortcomings, was beginning to understand that change was not just possible, it was necessary. The quiet storm that had started on a plane was now spreading outward, touching lives in ways neither woman could yet fully grasp. And though the road ahead was long and uncertain, both of them were committed to walking it, one step at a time. The days grew shorter, and the chill of autumn settled into the city. But for Sophia and Ava, time seemed to move with an urgency neither could escape. The incident on the flight had been a catalyst, a spark that set long smoldering tensions ablaze. Now, both women found themselves navigating the aftermath, their lives moving on parallel tracks toward an inevitable intersection. Sophia's voice was growing louder. Her speech at the community forum had struck a chord, and word spread quickly. Invitations to speak at other events began to trickle in, and soon her inbox was filled with requests. Each email carried a note of gratitude or a story of someone else's experience, another mother, another child, another quiet moment of dismissal that had left a lasting scar. Sophia read them all, each one a reminder that her fight was not hers alone. But with the growing attention came new challenges. Online, not everyone was supportive. Anonymous comments accused her of overreacting, of seeking attention, of playing the victim. The words were sharp, designed to cut, but Sophia had learned long ago how to bear the sting of criticism. Still, she couldn't deny the fatigue creeping into her bones. She carried her fight like a banner. But it was heavy, and there were moments when she wondered how long she could hold it aloft. Ava, too, was struggling. Her meeting with the airline's management had led to a series of training sessions on bias and inclusivity. Sessions she was now tasked with co-leading. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who had failed so publicly, was now in a position to teach others. But Ava approached the role with humility, sharing her story openly during the sessions. At first, her colleagues were skeptical. Some nodded along politely, but Ava could see the doubt in their eyes. Others were more vocal, questioning why such training was necessary in the first place. "I treat everyone the same," one flight attendant said during a session, her tone defensive. "Why should I feel guilty for something I haven't done?" Ava took a deep breath before responding. "It's not about guilt," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's about awareness. It's about recognizing the things we don't see because they don't affect us directly. I didn't think I had biases either until someone showed me how my actions said otherwise." Her words hung in the air, met with a mix of silence and murmured agreement. Ava knew change wouldn't come easily, but she was determined to push forward. If Sophia had taught her anything, it was that progress required persistence. The turning point came on a brisk November morning. Sophia was preparing for another speaking engagement. Her notes spread across the dining table. When her phone buzzed, it was an email from the airline. She opened it cautiously, her pulse quickening as she read. The message was brief but impactful. The airline had decided to implement mandatory bias training for all employees. Starting with Ava's department, they also extended an invitation for Sophia to meet with their leadership team to discuss further steps. Sophia's hand trembled as she set the phone down. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. She thought of Liam, of the countless other children who might benefit from this change. And a small smile broke across her face. This was why she fought, not for herself, but for them. The meeting between Sophia and the airline's leadership took place in a sleek conference room. The walls lined with awards and plaques that spoke of the company's achievements. Ava was there, seated at the far end of the table. When their eyes met, there was no animosity, only a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. The conversation was tense at first. The executives spoke in measured tones, their language carefully crafted to avoid controversy. But Sophia wasn't there to be placated. She listened patiently, then leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. "This isn't just about training," she said. "It's about creating a culture where everyone feels seen and valued. That starts at the top. If you're not willing to lead by example, no amount of training will make a difference." Her words were met with a heavy silence. Ava glanced around the table, watching the executives shift uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, one of them, a woman in her 50s with a commanding presence, spoke up. "You're right," she said. "This has to be more than a box we check. It has to be part of who we are." The tension in the room eased slightly, and the conversation turned to actionable steps. Sophia left the meeting feeling a sense of cautious optimism. The fight wasn't over, but she had planted a seed. Now, it was up to the airline to let it grow. That evening, as Sophia walked home, she felt the crisp autumn air bite at her cheeks. She thought of Ava, of the changes she was trying to make within the airline, and felt a flicker of hope. People could change, systems could change. It was slow, painful work, but it was possible. When she reached her apartment, Liam ran to greet her, his arms wrapping tightly around her waist. "How was your meeting, Mom?" he asked, his voice bright. Sophia knelt down to his level, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "It went well, baby," she said. "We're making progress." Liam smiled, and in that moment, Sophia felt the weight of the day lift. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like they were moving in the right direction. As she tucked Liam into bed that night, Sophia whispered a silent promise to herself and to him. She would keep fighting, no matter how long it took, because he deserved a world that saw him for who he truly was, a boy full of light and potential, unburdened by the shadows of prejudice. And as she turned out the light, Sophia felt the quiet power of hope burning within her. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was steady, and it was enough to carry her forward. The city buzzed with its usual energy, but for Sophia, The rhythm of her days had shifted. The demands of her advocacy work had grown. And with it, the weight of expectation. She found herself pulled in multiple directions, preparing speeches, responding to emails, and attending meetings, all while trying to preserve a sense of normalcy for Liam. Each new opportunity felt like a small victory. Yet the larger battle loomed ever larger. Its scale daunting. One morning, Sophia sat at her kitchen table, her coffee untouched as she stared at a draft of her next speech. The words on the page felt insufficient, unable to capture the complexity of what she wanted to convey. She thought of her audience, people who had lived through decades of change yet had seen how deeply racism could embed itself into the fabric of everyday life. How could she reach them? How could she make them feel the urgency she carried in her bones? Liam's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom, can you help me with this?" She turned to see him holding a piece of paper, his face scrunched in concentration. It was a worksheet from school, something about patterns and shapes. But his presence reminded her of why she was fighting. She set her speech aside and joined him, her hands guiding his small ones as they worked through the problem together. "You're really good at this," she said, smiling as he completed the task. Liam beamed, his earlier frustration forgotten, and in that moment, Sophia felt her own resolve strengthen. The fight wasn't just for her, it was for him. For his future. For a world where he wouldn't have to bear the burdens she had carried. Meanwhile, Ava stood in the middle of a training session, her hands gripping the edges of a podium as she addressed a group of flight attendants. The sessions had grown larger as the airline expanded its efforts. And Ava's story had become a central part of the curriculum. She spoke openly about her mistakes, about the ways unconscious bias could seep into even the most mundane interactions. "I didn't realize what I was doing," she admitted, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But that's the point. We don't realize it, and that's why it's so dangerous. Because it's not just about one interaction, it's about the patterns we create without even noticing." The room was silent, the attendants listening intently. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ava knew she couldn't reach everyone. But she also knew that change often started with discomfort. If she could plant even a single seed of awareness, it would be worth it. After the session, one of the attendants approached her, a young woman with wide, earnest eyes. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said. "It made me think about my own actions in ways I hadn't before." Ava smiled, the woman's words offering a small but meaningful reassurance. "That's all I can ask," she replied. The next confrontation came in a more unexpected setting. Sophia had been invited to a panel discussion on systemic racism, held at a local university. The audience was a mix of students, professors, and community members, their faces a tapestry of curiosity and skepticism. The discussion began cordially enough, with panelists sharing their perspectives on the historical roots of inequality. But as the conversation deepened, a man in the audience raised his hand, his expression sharp. "I understand that racism exists," he said, his voice firm, "but don't you think we're overcorrecting? Aren't we making everything about race when it doesn't need to be?" The room tensed, all eyes turning to Sophia. She leaned forward, her gaze steady as she addressed the man. "Race is not something we choose to make central," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "It's made central by the systems we live in, systems that decide who gets to move freely, who gets the benefit of the doubt, and who is seen as less than." She paused, letting her words sink in. "When my son is treated differently because of the color of his skin, that's not me making it about race. That's the world imposing it on him. And until that changes, we have a responsibility to confront it head on." The audience erupted into applause. But Sophia's eyes remained on the man. He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a crack in the wall, a small step toward understanding. Later that night, Sophia sat on the edge of Liam's bed, reading him a story as he drifted off to sleep. His small body relaxed against the pillows, his breathing slow and even. She closed the book softly and leaned down to kiss his forehead. As she left the room, she found herself standing in the hallway, the weight of the day pressing down on her. The panel had been a success, but it had also been exhausting. She thought of the man's question, of the resistance she often faced when talking about race. It wasn't just ignorance, it was fear. Fear of change, fear of losing power, fear of confronting uncomfortable truths. But Sophia wasn't afraid. She had lived with those truths her entire life. and she knew that ignoring them only allowed them to fester. The fight was hard, yes, but it was necessary. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Ava. Just finished another session. Thought of you today. Thanks for pushing me to be better. Sophia smiled, a small warmth spreading through her chest. Ava's journey was far from over, but the fact that she had taken even this step felt significant. It was a reminder that change, however slow, was possible. Sophia typed back a reply. Keep going. We're in this together. As she set the phone down, she felt the quiet hum of hope beneath her exhaustion. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't walking it alone. The morning broke over the city with a sharp clarity that seemed to promise something new. Sophia felt it as she walked Liam to school, the weight of the past weeks settling into something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't peace, she was far from done, but there was a sense of movement, of the world shifting in imperceptible but significant ways. As Liam skipped ahead, carefree and untethered, Sophia allowed herself a moment to breathe. She thought of the countless small victories she'd achieved, the forum, the panel, the changes the airline was beginning to implement. Each one was a step, but together they felt like the beginnings of a path. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an email, this one from a journalist who had attended the panel discussion. They wanted to feature her story in a national piece about everyday activism and the fight against systemic racism. Sophia's first instinct was hesitation. She wasn't looking for attention, and she worried that her story would become diluted, turned into a soundbite. But as she watched Liam dart toward the schoolyard, his laughter ringing out like a bell, she realized the importance of saying yes. It wasn't about her. It was about ensuring that stories like hers, like his, were seen and heard. She typed her reply. I'd be happy to speak with you. That afternoon, Ava found herself standing in front of a mirror in the airline's break room. Adjusting her uniform, the reflection felt different now, not just a face and a name, but a person who was finally beginning to understand her place in the world. Her impact on it. Her phone chimed with a notification. It was from Sophia, a response to the text Ava had sent the night before. The message was short, but it carried a weight that Ava hadn't anticipated. We're in this together. Ava stared at the words, her throat tightening. She hadn't expected forgiveness, let alone solidarity. But Sophia's message reminded her that change wasn't a solitary act. It was a collective endeavor, built on the courage to face hard truths and the willingness to rebuild what had been broken. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, her resolve firm. The next training session would be her most personal, yet a deep dive into how implicit bias shaped her own actions. She wanted her colleagues to see that growth was possible, but only if they were willing to look inward. The journalist arrived at Sophia's apartment a few days later, a young woman with a notebook and a quiet determination. They sat at the dining table, the recorder between them capturing every word as Sophia recounted the events of the flight, the ripple effects that had followed, and her growing role in the fight for justice. What keeps you going? The journalist asked, her pen poised. Sophia glanced at Liam, who was coloring at the far end of the table, oblivious to the conversation. Him, she said simply, and the knowledge that his future depends on what we do now. If I don't fight, who will? The journalist nodded, her eyes softening. Do you think the world can change? Sophia's gaze was steady. It has to, she said, but change isn't something that happens on its own. It's something we create, one choice at a time. The article was published 2 weeks later, and the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from across the country, some offering support, others sharing stories that mirrored Sophia's. But there were also messages of resistance, sharp-edged and cruel, accusing her of stirring up trouble, of seeing problems where there were none. Sophia read them all, even the hateful ones. They didn't deter her, in fact. They strengthened her resolve. If people were reacting this strongly, it meant the conversation was striking a nerve. And that was how change began. The final collision between Sophia and Ava came at an event hosted by the airline, a forum for employees and passengers to discuss the new bias training program. Sophia had been invited to speak, and Ava was there as a representative of the flight crew. When Sophia stepped onto the stage, she scanned the room, her eyes landing on Ava. Their gazes met, and for a moment, the rest of the room faded away. There was no animosity in Ava's expression, now only a quiet respect. Sophia began her speech, recounting the flight, the aftermath, and the lessons it had taught her. She spoke about the quiet ways racism embedded itself into daily life. How it was often disguised as indifference or professionalism. But she also spoke about hope, about the power of accountability, growth, and collective action. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Ava was the first to stand. After the event, Ava approached Sophia, her movements tentative but deliberate. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, "for everything, for holding me accountable, but also for giving me the chance to grow." Sophia studied her for a moment, then extended a hand. "Thank you for choosing to change." They shook hands. The gesture simple but profound. It wasn't the end of their story, but it was a new chapter, one built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to a better world. Later that evening, as Sophia and Liam walked home, he looked up at her, his small hand in hers. "Mom," he said, his voice full of curiosity, "do you think people can really change?" Sophia smiled, her heart swelling with love and hope. "Yes, baby," she said, "I believe they can, but it takes courage, and it takes work." Liam nodded, his expression thoughtful, and as they continued down the street, the city lights glowing around them, Sophia felt a quiet certainty settle over her. The road ahead was long, but it was worth walking for him, for herself, and for everyone who deserved a world that saw them fully, without prejudice or fear. And as she looked toward the horizon, she knew they were moving forward, together.